Welcome to this Chatham House members event on Crimea, living with adversity on the occupied peninsula. I'm Robert Brinkley. I chair the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. This event is on the record, and the recording will go on the Chatham House website. As you all know, 7 years ago, Russia annexed Crimea. The United Nations General Assembly declared the annexation illegal. And as far as I know, no other state has recognized Crimea's incorporation into Russia. But whereas on the Donbass, there's continuing diplomatic and indeed military activity, despite the lack of progress in resolving that conflict, Crimea has almost dropped out of the international news. And it seems that Russia has something to hide. The peninsula remains closed to international monitoring missions. Access for the international media is problematic, to say the least. But today, we're fortunate enough to hear from 3 international journalists who have each visited Crimea and observed life after the annexation. And they are Natalia Humaniuk, Anton Alexeyev, and Joshua Yaffa. Each of them is going to speak for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll have half an hour for your questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A function, and I will then read out your questions for the panelists to answer. And we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time available, which will take us up to 2 o'clock, 1400 London time. For this webinar, there is interpretation between English and Russian. Anton Alexeyev will speak in Russian. If you wish, you can choose the English channel on the Zoom interpretation function. So let me start by introducing Natalia Humaniuk. She's a journalist specializing in human rights and international conflict and security reporting. Her expertise lies in Ukraine, Russia, and the Middle East. She currently works at Suspilne, which is Ukraine's national broadcaster. Previously, she was the head of the Hromadsky television channel. And she's a good friend of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. She founded the Public Interest Journalism Lab, an initiative promoting discussion on social topics, and she's the author of a book about Crimea under occupation called Lost Island, which she tells me is not yet translated into English, but we can look forward to it coming out in English. Natalia, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm happy, in fact, to share what I know, because what I want to say that there is information about what's going on in the occupied Crimea. The issue is about listening to what's going on, despite all the complication. For many people, Crimea today is something a bit kind of an old same story. It had been occupied 7 years. We can discuss the same issues about the breach of the international laws. We can do little about it. However, for me, I'm traveling, I'm speaking to the people for the last 7 years. I may say that every day there is a news from Crimea. Just today, there had been another journalist detained, Vladimir Yesipenko, who is from Radio Liberty. He used to work undercover and he's charged. So that's something like that is happening all the time. Also, today we can see the long-lasting effects of the occupation. I also want to bring the attention to the whole situation, how the COVID pandemics had created the even more drastic situation for the people residing in Crimea. For almost a year, it's impossible almost to travel from occupied Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland. Before, there were despite the occupation, still the people can cross those couple of the checkpoints. Now you should be either father or mother or your relative should live in Crimea. So a lot of different people who used to travel at least to see their relatives, they are not anymore going. A lot of people who use this opportunity. And also Crimeans are allowed to leave to Ukrainian mainland once per year for very important reason. That's something very difficult. Also, because of the situation we have now within the year, more than 100 political prisoners kept in Crimea, mainly in jails. They are mainly accused of the Crimean Tatars. These are persecution regarding their religious beliefs. The point was that a year ago, the Secretary General of the UN called for release of the political prisoners due to COVID, because there is a drastic situation and the risk for them in the prisons in Russia and in Crimea, but nothing had happened. More people were detained this year. But speaking about the long-lasting and new issues, so for instance, few people may know how critical had become situation with the environment. The reason for that within the last years, more than 500,000 people, 500,000 people were encouraged to move to Crimea from Russian mainland, mainly to the towns of Simferopol and Sevastopol. There are a lot of them are military. There are people who are working with, prosecutors, bureaucrats. Yet it created the huge pressure on the infrastructure in Sevastopol and Simferopol. In Crimea, there are 2 million people. You see, another 500,000 people have come. So, for instance, there are issues with building houses, building apartments, lack of water, pressure for infrastructure, which hadn't been created for that way. Or, for instance, moving some of the parts of the rivers and lakes to provide to, for instance, the capital, Simferopol. At the same time, it creates the drain to the rivers near the town of Bakhchisarai, where mainly Crimean Tatar community resides. And they are coming to the sometimes protest. But these are the new things which you might maybe not heard before. Also, the huge issue has become the militarization. We know about that, but we're speaking about such breach of the Geneva Convention as the conscription of the Crimeans. You are not allowed to conscript the people in the annexed part of the land. And we can imagine these are Ukrainians, these are Russians of different views, and these are Crimean Tatars, which potentially should fight against Ukraine in a different situation. And that's something which is not really raised a lot today internationally. What I want to also raise, yes, probably some findings of my book, which has been based on my 7-year reporting on Crimea. It's about how gradually the situation had been changing in Crimea, and it mainly talks about human cost. And I also think that it's often not mentioned. There is a discussion about geopolitics, but less about the human cost. I can't stress less the whole process against the Crimean Tatars. This community in Ukraine had been always, let's say, more secular. There was never a terrorist attack in Crimea during the, since the independence of Ukraine, but this is a Muslim minority. It happened that a lot of law enforcement agents had been moved to Crimea from such regions as Caucasus, Tatarstan, where there is an issue of the Islamic radicalism. It hadn't been the issue for Crimea. However, the attitude towards Crimean Tatars is more or less like that. So there are searches in the mosques, and it's very difficult to raise this issue in current international environment. And more people are, arrested just for practicing Muslim. But there is some interesting moments to mention. So, for instance, those people who are now behind the bars, they have 200 kids. The persecution started in 2016. Since that time, there is a community of like Crimean Solidarity in Crimea, which collects the money and every month, give a birth to every kid around like 70 euros. So you see that there is some potential of the self-organization of the people who can provide in such a shut down part of the land. There is a situation which are less told. So, for instance, I've done the story about substitution therapy, which is forbidden, was allowed in Ukraine, forbidden in Russia. At the time of the annexation, there were 800 people who were living on the drug addict who were receiving this methadone substitution therapy. The time when I was doing my investigations 5 years later, we found out that many, like thousands, hundreds of them had passed away. International community was warned about that. Now we can, find maybe a few dozens of those people. We don't know. I mean, a lot of people whom I talked said that like at least half of them passed away, but they are also usually not really mentioned. So this what probably I want to say, but to summarize, my colleagues probably would speak more about the economic situation. We can discuss that. But I think it's very important to remember and not to, as the author of the book, I've given quite a few interviews, especially to the colleagues from Russia, from Georgia, from post-Soviet countries, and international reporters. And they usually ask, but like, is the economic situation is better in Crimea? And I usually said like, yeah, maybe there is some road built or airport or something like that. However, it can't be an excuse for the fact that just some part of the land is more poor, and with this reason another country can occupy it. If you really bring this logic to the international audience, you can say that any richer country, like US can occupy part of the Mexico because US is richer. So I do think it's something to stress. And finally, there is a lot more, of course, I can say on the situation, because what my talks with many people said, that they were really expecting to live in the Soviet Union, and Russia turned to be not Soviet Union. First of all, from the point of view of the social services, it's not really that like you have cheap goods, free health care. There are all of like, Russia is a capitalistic state, so people were probably not really expecting that. And the new thing, just last Friday, finally, the Ukrainian government had finally adopted the strategy on the deoccupation of Crimea. This document hadn't been existed yet. It should be published more or less within the next days. But I think that there is a bit of the movement. It's announced this year there would be this summit of the Crimean platform, more or less the coordination between different bodies, prosecutor of Crimea, the representation of the Office of the President of Ukraine on the issues of Crimea, different human rights, Ministry of the Reintegration. It unites all these bodies. I know that there would be some kind of a summit in end of August where a lot of international partners are invited. But what it aimed to coordinate what can be done. Something can be done to help the people which are living in the, for instance, occupied Crimea, to receive some services which are not for them now available, but could be received digitally. Some activities should be done for the support of the Crimean Tatars. But the whole idea is to brainstorm and see where is the potential where some change, even the minor change, is possible, and also where the international audience, international institutions can maybe participate. Maybe earlier there was no discussion about sending the monitoring mission on environment, and now this discussion is happening. So what is interesting that within the half year, I expect some of the discussion in Ukraine on some topics which human rights activists for a while were trying to bring, and at least we expect that maybe all the summits with journalists, we are skeptical, are not something as a solution. But this discussion is at least there, and it may create some pretext to finally speak again about the everyday situation in the occupied peninsula. Thanks a lot for the attention. I think quite a lot of data, but I really think that many of those things are not known even for the large Ukrainian public, because it's, again, has becoming kind of the old same story, and there is some level of the fatigue. We are, but there is an opportunity to overcome it.
Natalia, thank you very much indeed. You've really given us some impressions from the human point of view of what the effects are on particularly people living in Crimea, Crimean Tatars and others. Very useful to have that perspective. I want to turn now to Anton Alexeyev, who is Moscow correspondent at ETV, Estonian Public Broadcasting. He writes about regional politics, covering recently the Belarusian presidential elections last year, fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the 2019 Ukrainian elections, among other things. And in 2020, he produced a film about life in Crimea after 6 years of annexation. So that was a year ago, a 45-minute film which went out on Estonian public broadcasting. So let's now listen to Anton, his perspective as an Estonian journalist based in Moscow. Anton, over to you.
Здравствуйте, очень приятно.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be talking to you. And from the outset, I should say that I do not speak English, unfortunately. I never studied it. But indeed, I've lived most of my life in Moscow. And it is true that I might perceive many things at the post-Soviet space as a Muscovite. It was interesting for me to go to Crimea. I was there in 2014 during the so-called referendum, and I reported the very process of annexation of Crimea. I never visited it within the next 6 years. It was not technically feasible. But I understood that if you're a reporter and you have an opportunity to go to Crimea, you should do that in line with the Ukrainian law. Russia encourages reporters to go to Crimea, but it encourages us to do that via the Russian territory, which would be the infringement on the Ukrainian law. Before going to Crimea, I spoke to Natalia Gumenyuk, and she shared a lot of very valuable data and information for me to get better prepared for this journey. I plan to have a series of very brief reports from Crimea later, and due to the pandemic, I had to give up this idea. So I collected all of my footage and I made this video film. I remembered Crimea back in 2014, and I'm sure that my experiences do not differ much from those who were there amongst you. My impression was that it was quite a strange territory, not quite Russian one. If you ever visited Russia, large cities, megapolises, for example, then you will be surprised to see that Crimea has nothing in common with large cities, nor does it have anything in common with smaller towns. And some people say that sanctions, Western sanctions in Crimea do not work. That's not quite true, because you cannot use your pay cards, you cannot use your mobile applications to hail a cab. You would not see their global shop or retail chains. But people who I remember from back in 2014, and those who were inspired and happy to finally be part of Russia, in 2020 were disillusioned. Maybe not quite disillusioned, but it seems that they got down to earth. They became more realistic, and they are not very happy with the reality that they had to face. The issue is that Russia, on the one hand, does invest a lot into Crimea. It constructed a bridge, it continues to build roads, airports, and housing, but it does not affect the life of the local residents positively. Back in 2014, I was impressed by Sevastopol with the Russian naval base there. It was very pro-Russian, and people were more patriotic than in Moscow, say. But now in 2020, people were worried because they were robbed of their real estate, of their land plots, because the Russian armed forces claimed ownership of those land plots. Moreover, the Russian military, when they need anything, they will get it, and any court will rule in their favor. If you have, say, a land plot, a garden that they claim is part of their territory, you will never prove that you have the property right to that land plot. And in Sevastopol, I saw that the military would be taking away land plots just for the sake of security. That was the major argument. But as a result, this land is never tilled. So if it used to be a shop or a warehouse, then it continues to be the shop and the warehouse, but the rent would be paid to the military. So people thus cannot understand why Russia, why Moscow treats them like that. They believe that they are patriots of Russia, almost everyone with whom I spoke there. I do not speak about the Crimean Tatars here, of course. But they say we voted during the referendum for joining Russia. We support Putin as the president. We support the unified Russia as our party of preference. Why is our land taken away from us? Why don't we have water supplies? Why don't we have jobs? And not a single company, a renowned company, can enter Crimea and work there. Even the Russian firms, because otherwise they risk being sanctioned by the West. And that poses a lot of challenges to people. As far as Crimean Tatars are concerned, it is a painful topic indeed. And Natalia is quite right in that the issue is that under Ukraine, Hizb ut-Tahrir as an organization is totally, was and is totally legitimate. But in 2003, it was outlawed in Russia because the special forces or secret forces, FSB, suspected that organization of extremism. When the Crimean Peninsula was annexed, it still worked there as a charity. And now that it is banned in the Russian Federation, the very fact that people studied Quran as a member of that organization, or if you got some charity donation from that organization, you will be treated as an extremist or a terrorist. Thus, any Crimean Tatar who practices Islam cannot feel totally safe and secure. And the special services, security services of the Russian Federation scrutinize them very closely. Of course, there are some Crimean Tatars who prosper and who collaborate with powers that be, but those are few. And if you are a journalist and if you're listening to me, I encourage you to go there once it is possible due to some quarantine restrictions. You should get the Russian visa and you should seek permit or permission from the Ukrainian authorities and enter that territory. Perhaps you would not be totally free to talk to people, but you will make your own impression of what's going on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's some very interesting points you made there that clearly the international sanctions are having an effect in Crimea, in everyday life in Crimea. And the point you made about the difference between 2014 and 2020 in people's attitudes, people who welcomed the arrival of the Russian state, but by now are feeling very disillusioned by the effects. And that was very interesting to hear your account of that. Someone has asked in the questions, how can we see your films on Crimea? Could you just quickly say how someone can watch your film on Crimea?
Этот фильм доступен на русском и
This film is available in Estonian and in Russian. And it is 45 minutes long, as David said. I can send a link to those who are interested, and it's available in Facebook. And I'm sure that after this event, I will send it to Anna or somebody else in Chatham House, and you will be able to see it, Robert.
Great, thank you. If someone could just send the link around. I'd like to turn now to the third of our speakers, Joshua Yaffa, who is Moscow correspondent of the New Yorker. And indeed, over the last decade or so, he has been reporting from Moscow for a number of publications, for Bloomberg, Business Week, The Economist, The National Geographic, among others. And he was a finalist for a Livingston Award for his work on Russia and authored the book Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition and Compromise in Putin's Russia. Joshua, over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and happy to listen to my other panelists and have this conversation about a topic that's of great interest to me personally, but indeed is rarely discussed in either journalistic or public settings. In any case, my experience with Crimea is much more personal, I guess I would say, than Natalia or Anton's, in that I came to know Crimea, at least post-2014, through the perspective of one individual who I'll talk about today, who featured as one of the main characters in the book that I released last year, Robert mentioned, Between Two Fires, story of different people in contemporary Russia learning to, or being forced to, make do with the system and make compromises with it. And one of the characters I wrote about in this context is a businessman, entrepreneur in Crimea named Oleg Zubkov, a really colorful, over-the-top individual. Lots of people in Crimea know him. Lots of people have a either love or hate relationship with him. He has a loud personality and certainly doesn't leave people indifferent to his character and actions. But his overall trajectory is telling for the reason that you mentioned, Robert, and that Anton laid out, in that he is very much a person who went from a kind of uber patriotic, enthusiastic response to the referendum anti-annexation and to Russia joining Crimea, to one of real disappointment and disillusionment, of feeling as that he had been misled, or as he admitted to me in kind of more honest moments, had misled himself. In other words, it wasn't just that he fell a victim to a propaganda campaign, but he himself kind of perpetuated in his own mind a propaganda about what was happening and the state that he was joining. As Natalia mentioned, I think this is important to understand the mentality of many people in 2014. It wasn't so much a desire to join Russia, the kind of Russia of 2014, contemporary Russia, Putin's Russia. It was more a desire to return to a kind of mythologized past, a kind of mythical Soviet past that Russia seemed to be the natural inheritor of. It seemed like Russia, and today's Russia, was the kind of descendant of the state. But in fact, the two things are, of course, very separate. And that's something that Zubkov and so many others only found out after the fact. Zubkov himself is Russian, ethnically Russian, born in Kursk in Western Russia, moved to Kiev as a promising young naval cadet in the 80s, finished Naval Academy in Kiev, married in Kiev, and moved to Crimea in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Crimea was Ukrainian. Although I think it's worth remarking that for most people, certainly for Zubkov and his family, Crimea's particular kind of political, geopolitical allegiance and status didn't mean all that much until it became the center of these incredibly fraught and emotionally kind of intense questions. In other words, Zubkov was happy to live in Crimea for many years, not really thinking all that much about was this Ukrainian land or Russian land and so on. He spoke Russian, he, as do most people, as their native language in Crimea, and wasn't so much bothered by which state Crimea belonged to. Though there was clearly a kind of deep-seated among Zubkov, and here I think this, we can say this was fairly widespread in 2014, there was a kind of latent, deeply buried nostalgia, not just for Russia, as I said, but for this kind of great mythologized past when people in Crimea belonged to a large, united, powerful country, and Zubkov's emotions, his patriotic emotions, were awakened by the events on Maidan in 2014, by the fall of the Yanukovych government, but more, I think, acutely by this combination of kind of emotional campaign and this propaganda campaign being waged from Russia and also from kind of pro-Russian or Russian-speaking sources in Ukraine and certainly in Crimea. That led him to be a quite emotionally invested supporter of the referendum of annexation. He recorded a now infamous video in which he stood next to some of the lions from his safari park. His kind of claim to fame, why he was a notable figure and is in Crimea, is he owns 2 zoos and safari parks and is a successful entrepreneur. At the height of the kind of tensions in the days leading up to the referendum, when Russian forces, the so-called Little Green Men, were already effectively occupying Crimea, the situation was quite tense, especially with Ukrainian military still on the ground. Zubkov filmed an advert, a political advertisement, in which he stood next to the lions from his safari park and with them kind of bearing and gnashing their teeth, warned that anyone who tried to come to Crimea and interfere with this historic and just process of Russia, of Crimea returning to Russia, would have to, talk to his lions. And this made him for at least a minute, gave him a kind of 15 minutes of fame, I guess is the best way to put it in the context of Crimean annexation. He was quite thrilled when the referendum kind of went as was obviously going to be the case. Crimea was annexed, joined Russia, but very quickly the wool came to fall from his eyes, in that he understood he wasn't joining this kind of great and all-powerful, benevolent state as he imagined it, but was in fact joining modern-day Russia with all of its inefficiencies, all of its bureaucratic kind of straitjackets, the corruption, the cynical position and intentions of many of the functionaries and authorities in that system. Very quickly, his parks became the subject of one inspection after another, whether it was the veterinary service, whether it was the tax service. He was charged with animal endangerment in the wake of blackouts that spread across Crimea in the initial years after annexation, when the power went out across the peninsula. He was unable to properly heat the enclosures for some of his tigers. Some died. The authorities used that as a pretext to charge him with animal endangerment. All said, at least when I was actively reporting on Zubkov, and this would have been back last in 2018, he was in court about 500 times, 500 separate court proceedings for one reason or another. The Crimean authorities, on the one hand, I think seeing in him as someone who kind of refused to play by the new rules, a loose cannon, this guy who was really emotional and not willing to, in the theme of my book, kind of compromise and play by the new rules of the game. On the one hand, they wanted to teach him a lesson, if not kind of crush him effectively for that reason. On the other, of course, there were all sorts of corrupt, venal business reasons why various officials in the Crimean kind of power structure, the new Russian installed authorities, had an eye on his safari parks, which were quite a attractive and successful moneymaker. So he's fought off numerous attempts to either have his parks closed or taken from him. He's been in and out of court. He's been in and out of jail, and he has come to really regret his initial enthusiasm, be kind of embarrassed, if not ashamed, by the degree and the kind of emotionality of his support for annexation. He still has an armored personnel carrier that sits kind of in the entryway to his safari park Taigan that he rode around in the days after the referendum in 2014 to kind of celebrate Russia annexing Crimea and the return of Crimea to Russia. He was so joyous, he threw a party and he drove around the territory of Taigan waving a Russian flag in this armored personnel carrier. He now, as he explained to me, keeps this armored personnel carrier near the entrance of Taigan as a kind of testament or monument to his naivete, to his dashed hopes. He really does feel kind of disappointed and fooled in that he really did, I think, like so many people in Crimea, have real sincere hopes that with Russia annexing Crimea and taking over the territory, there would be lots of new investment, there would be business programs, there would be kind of new tourism initiatives, and he feels let down that so much of that never came to pass. And instead, he has been dragged through these various court proceedings and have his business nearly taken from him, and still doesn't feel protected or safe. All that said, yeah.
Joshua, are you just about to wind it up now?
Sure. Yeah. I have last comment was just to say Zubkov is a very colorful and compelling character who I think does say a lot about the trajectory of the last 7 years. But I think more common both among Zubkov's employees, the people who work at his park, other people I met in my reporting trip to Crimea, is a kind of apathy. I think that the degree of Zubkov's frustration is actually not representative. He was a much more enthusiastic supporter of annexation, and he's now much kind of more kind of committed and has a much deeper sense of disappointment and frustration. I think the more common trajectory is frankly one of apathy, people who don't kind of have in one way or another that strong of feelings. The situation in Crimea is not ideal, but for many people kind of livable and manageable. And I think most people, rather than kind of being actively for or against these days, circa 2021, my sense or my estimation is that most people essentially kind of shrug their shoulders, move on with life, make do with the situation, however unideal it is, and don't necessarily think like Zubkov does that he wishes he had the chance to do it all over again and stay in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating to hear that, and I can see why Mr. Zubkov makes such a good story, and it helps to bring to life what the other speakers were saying about the change of attitudes over the past 7 years, the lack of respect for property rights, and the fact that someone who was so enthusiastic about the annexation could then end up in court 500 times, and it tells you something. But thank you for your point at the end, that his story is not necessarily typical of most of the people on the peninsula. I'm going to turn now to questions, and we've got some questions coming in, and I encourage people to submit more. Let's start off with one from Bernard Herman, and I'll address this to Natalia. When the Crimea was annexed, why was there not more resistance from Ukrainian naval units there? Natalia.
Today, according to the decision of the European Court of European Human Rights Court, it's officially said that the de facto occupation had started on the 26th February 2014. That's when we know that the Russian troops had been already in Crimea, and they've been overtaking the Rada, the Council of the Autonomous Republic. At that moment, we should remember that Ukraine just lived through the Euromaidan revolution. It was like 3 or 4 days since the former president escaped. By the way, also as he escaped to Russia while also going to Crimea. And the head of the Ukrainian army was a close ally, which we also understand cooperating with the Russian state. So, of course, is the case of the effective treason, let's say, by some of the Ukrainian officials who now residing mainly in Russia. So there was, of course, a lot of the confusion by the Ukrainian new authorities. They couldn't really control that. But I should say that wherever you talk to everybody now, to the army, of course, somehow the whole Ukrainian army hadn't been ever trained to fight and defend itself from Russia. When you really for a while discussed that with the Ukrainian military or everybody, they said that for many years, even by 2014, the most training were really against kind of the Western allies. So the cooperation between the Ukrainian and Russian security service, not I would say rather infiltration of the Ukrainian security service had taken place. I think still there is a very challenging experience about the really fighting at that very vulnerable moment with the people you lived so close. We know that now again politically that the Russian fleet had been staying in Crimea, in Sevastopol. That also was negotiated years ago. That was the issue of the national security. But Ukraine in 90s made this choice. So I don't think that that can be really much change. But I want to quote something. I had a chance to talk to the head of the NATO allied forces, General Bridlow, who was leading the NATO allied forces in February 2014. And I really asked him, did they really know at that moment that they were not little green mans, but they were Russian army overtaking Crimea? And he said that, yes, we knew. In fact, there were some allies of NATO who didn't really want, members of the NATO who really didn't want to accept that, to hear this information. And I remember very well that for the first half year after annexation, we really wasted a lot of time on explaining to the international audience, to everywhere, why there was a Russian occupation, not the kind of a real protest of the people. So for me, it was a bit disappointed to hear from the high-profile NATO officials that like they really knew. Somehow we really, all the effort was, but so much effort of the Ukrainian state and everybody was just for first months of the annexation to prove it is happening. So this is my my real answer, but the answer is really historic, kind of based in the early history of Ukraine after the independence.
Well, thank you, Natalia. And of course, there was a huge effort on behalf of the Kremlin to deny and obfuscate what was happening. It was only after several months that President Putin admitted that it indeed had been a Russian occupation. They started off for several months denying that, which was part of the reason for the confusion. I'd like to turn now to a couple more questions about public opinion in Crimea. That I'll put two together. There's one here from Jonathan Steele. Have there been any opinion polls on what people in Crimea think of their situation today? And then the other question, if I can reach it. Yes, from Christina Pashin. How are international journalists able to properly gauge public opinion among Crimean Tatars still in Crimea? How do the Crimean Tatars there actually feel about living under the Russian occupation? What are their future hopes? Perhaps I could turn first to Anton and then to Joshua. And Anton, public opinion in Crimea and specifically among the Crimean Tatars.
Я вам скажу так, что я
I can tell you that as I represent Estonian television, I actually should have met confidence and trust on the part of the locals. But the secret services did not treat us well, and we felt that people were worried when they spoke with us. And I had to persuade them that I will quote them verbatim. I would not cut anything from what they say in the interviews. And as far as Crimean Tatars are concerned, they understand that their situation won't change in the very near future. And they will have, under the circumstances, very dire circumstances for them, survive in the future. Then they are a very closed community, but they understand that they should get better open to the rest of the population. Otherwise, they will be squeezed out of that territory. There are problems with Crimean Tatar schools. The number of them has halved since the annexation. But as far as the Russian speaking residents are concerned, they say that they welcome diversity and they would welcome Crimean Tatars as part of the society in Russia. And powers that be seem to encourage this diversity. But if you ask them about what awaits them in that territory, their opinion is very similar to that in mainland Russia. Russia is not going to change, nor is it going to reform. The Russian regime is extremely conservative, and every Russian resident, including those living in Crimea, believes that their system of power would stay with them forever, as long as Putin is in the Kremlin.
Joshua, do you want to chip in on public opinion in Crimea?
I'll add maybe just a word or two about the situation with the Tatars, which I know a bit more about just because that was one of the other few communities, along with the story of Oleg Zubkov, that I had some time to spend time and talk to representatives of. In particular, one Crimean Tatar activist, Abdurashid Japarov, lives, as it happened, in the village nearby Zubkov Safari Park. So I was able to spend some time during my visit there with Japarov, and I think he has a really also telling story in that he, going back to his youth in the 80s, was an activist for Crimean Tatar rights in the Soviet period. And after 2014, he saw quite tragically his nephew and ultimately his own son disappear in kidnappings, of which there have been dozens recorded, of which young men go missing. The kinds of tactics we perhaps are most used to seeing in a place like Chechnya, young men rounded up by kind of unmarked, unannounced security forces and driven away in the cover of night, never to be seen again. Unfortunately, this phenomenon has come to Crimea as well, and Japarov has faced it personally with, as I said, his nephew and son disappearing in this way. And his own evolution is telling in that he has tried everything from petitioning the Crimean authorities directly, waging very public campaigns with many hundreds of Crimean Tatars kind of in the streets demanding information, demanding justice. He's had meetings with officials from the Russian authorities all the way up to the governor's office or the head of kind of Russian installed Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov. But he's also taken a position that I think kind of mirrors something that Anton spoke about toward the end, which is understanding in a rather clear-eyed way that this situation is unlikely to change anytime soon. That it would be unrealistic, however much Japarov might hope otherwise, that the kind of political arrangements in Crimea are going to change anytime soon, and thus, if the political arrangements are unlikely to change, it's unlikely he'll find out any more information about the fate of his son. And one of the activities, in addition to his activism, or part of his activism, that Japarov has taken up is being a kind of conflict mediator and coming to the scene of, say, a disappearance or an arrest of a young Crimean Tatar individual or activist, trying to mediate and calm the crowd, trying to prevent an escalation. His fear is that were the Crimean Tatar community to answer with force, to answer with confrontation, that would give the Russian authorities a kind of final excuse to go after or crush the Crimean Tatar community. So he finds himself very much walking this thin line, and he's really playing a kind of long game, talking about, what the Crimean Tatar community has to think about is how do we, survive this period intact, without facing the kinds of mass repressions that, of course, the Crimean Tatars in a sort of genetic or historical way remember well from the 1930s when they were deported en masse. So I think it's en masse. So it's a very difficult and delicate, I think, line for the Crimean Tatar community to walk. And Japarov, I think, is a kind of personal example of that.
Robert, can I maybe just shortly on the public poll saying, of course, I would be super cautious about having any public opinion poll in the occupied territory. We've been working a lot with that. Of course, there is a danger to talk. For me, the biggest change in Crimea was, there was a places where the cab drivers are talking to you when you're sitting, and they're quite annoying about telling how wrong things are. My first half a year in Crimea, when I moved back after the annexation, was when even the cab drivers stopped to talk to the strangers. So people are really, I've done a huge effort, for instance, on really talking to really a lot, let's say, apolitical people, not activists, but anything you discuss, economy, water supply, can be considered as political. So people would be very concerned. But to mention something important, that prior to the annexation, there was never a situation within the last years and the polls of the 2014, there were never less, more than even like in different stages of the Ukrainian history, 20% of the population who were considering rejoining with Russia. So there was no reason for any kind of a real referendum. Now with 500,000 people brought to the Crimea from the Russian mainland, I do think that there is also this challenge that the demographic had been changed in this way, that you should understand who do represent the opinion. As for Crimean Tatars, I'm answering all when I can, writing all the answers, having this short time at the Q&A. But to mention that now I'm also cooperating, for instance, doing another documentary with a Crimean Tatar co-author. So talking to really a lot of people living here in Kiev, being very close to this community even more. And 300,000 Crimean Tatars are residing in Crimea. They were really deported, 100% of them in 1944. Most of them were allowed to come back just with the independence of Ukraine. That was very harsh time for coming back. So there is a national idea not to leave Crimea unless it's absolute risk. So Crimean Tatar has this purpose to stay, especially in this context of the demographic change. So therefore, for instance, they probably, some of the people are doing something, but some people try to keep low profile. But that is the reason. That's why, for instance, many of them are not. There are way more people. So the fact they remain, it doesn't mean that it's okay for them to stay there.
Great, thank you. Natalia, there's been a question from Simon Hughes. Do you know whether there has been any emigration from Crimea to Russia? You've talked about movement of people the other way, 100,000 coming into Crimea. Has there been migration from Crimea into Russia?
No, it really is not the case. We have not that many. I think, if I'm not mistaken, up to 50,000 Crimeans who moved to Ukrainian territory, but most of the people, which is very different to the Donbas, they are staying at Crimea. As I mentioned, it's just happening in a different direction, this process.
Thank you. Now, the next question is on a different topic. This one's from Maria Shagina. Recently, a Chinese delegation has visited Crimea to explore tourism potential. What influence has China had on the peninsula in mitigating the impact of international sanctions? I wonder which of the speakers wants to try that one, China and Crimea.
I may shortly respond.
Yeah, Natalia, please.
Yeah, because I've been following to the, China is the member of the General of the Security Council in the UN, and we have also, Ukraine has the diplomatic kind of strong, as every country needs to have the cooperate with China. So we understand that China is quite a bit of the hesitant. It supports Russia in Security Council in the UN. However, it sometimes abstain in some of the major commands regarding, for instance, annexation, because I think there are the issues of the Taiwan for China and Hong Kong. So they have their own policy towards let's say, non-recognition of the breakaway territories. So China has their own political issue why they are the Russian ally yet, and they are playing the role in the Security Council, but that stops them a bit. But I don't think it might stop the Chinese tourists from coming to to Crimea. But I don't see a lot of foreign tourists coming to Crimea due to different reasons within the last years. It just technically extremely a complex route to make that because of the international travel and things like that.
And that was even before the pandemic. Yeah, I wondered, Anton, do you want to add anything?
Yes, if I may, my experience of visiting Yalta, just the resort capital of the pearl of the Crimean Peninsula, one of the bureaucrats of local authorities told me that there was an opportunity for foreigners to invest in Crimea by circumventing the sanctions at the same time. But if you speak about investment in tourism and in hospitality industry, it is questionable because Crimea, and I judge from the perspective of a Muscovite. I know how it is. It is cheaper for the Russians to go to Egypt or Turkey. Crimea is very expensive, and a lot of holiday making in Crimea are rather representatives of the bureaucracy from Russia or law enforcement. Those who cannot go abroad because powers that be, because the Russian government would insistently advise that they do so. So if you think of whether it is worth going to Crimea, you will see Ukrainian quality with Moscow prices. So it's not very attractive. So tourism is tourism. During the Soviet times, it was just a mecca for any tourist, but it's no longer so. So, and it is not lucrative at all for the government.
Thank you, Anton. We're coming to the end of our time. I'm just going to read out one more question, and I do apologize to those people who've asked questions that we haven't had time for. This one came in anonymously from an attendee. Do the panelists have any impressions on how average Crimean Tatars now perceive their political leadership, both the Mejlis, that is now banned as an extremist organization by the Russian Federation, and the Moscow-friendly substitute that the Russians have promoted in its place? And with that, I'd just like to ask each of our three panelists, perhaps in reverse order, so Joshua, then Anton, then Natalia, just to say a couple of words and we'll finish. Joshua, to you first, please.
I'll happily cede my time to Anton and Natalia, because that sort of fine-grained issue on Crimean Tatar mood is something I'd rather not speculate on, but listen to the experts on. So over to you, Anton and Natalia.
Joshua, thank you. Okay, Anton.
Мне не говорили это на камеру,
People would not tell it to me on record because they try to show that they are unified, both those who stay in Crimea and those who migrated to Ukraine. But I mentioned Hizb ut-Tahrir quite recently. And if you are suspected of any links with that organization, you are sure to have problems because it is prohibited in Russia. And if anyone suspects that you are linked to Mejlis as a representative body of the Crimean Tatars, you are sure to have problems in Crimea as well. And the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people have no opportunity to support Crimean Tatars on the ground in Crimea. So if we think of what brings Crimean Tatars together. It's their own self-organization in the Crimea, which is called Crimean Solidarity, and our children, or Crimean children, that's the organization that supports children of the detainees or political prisoners from amongst Crimean Tatars.
To finalize, I maybe correct a bit Anton on Hizb ut-Tahrir, which was really not something massive. I said like there were individuals, but now coming back to the issue, I probably would say that I can't underestimate the role of the Majlis as a very respected institution, and probably also explain to international community that its roots come to the dissident movement of the Soviet time, and Mustafa Dzhemilev, the founder, was the ones who was opposing, for instance, Soviet troops coming to the Prague. They have a huge tradition of the non-violent resistance in 80s. And those people are super respected. They are still on the top of the movement of the Crimean Tatar. What is fascinating for me was having so many, honestly, not very strong self-organized movement in post-Soviet world. The Majlis is that genuine institution created in 1991, democratically elected, which is really has its voice without having really strong formal representation in the Ukrainian state. They are the very important speakers. So for instance, when the Security Council was gathering in Ukraine last Thursday in Kiev, the two leaders of the Crimean Tatars, Majlis, had been at the president's office to be consulted, but they are not politically important because they don't have official Ukrainian title. It shows that you can't ignore them. Of course, there is a limit what they can do. They are banned from Russia, but they are still extremely important organization, and I do think it's something to unique and to mention. So my final call would be to say that despite everything sounds pessimistic and things are grave, and we discussed all those moments, there is a civil society in Crimea. They should be work undercover. There are a bunch of the organization and civil society organization working in Kiev, and there are things which are new, like environment, like things like that, which are probably not yet discussed, which can't be raised and can be brought to the agenda, which, as I started, can confront this fatigue of the old geopolitics we are discussing for the last 7 years.
Natalia, thank you. And a big thank you to all three of our panelists, Natalia Humaniuk, Anton Alexeyev, Joshua Yaffa. I think we've had a very rich discussion illustrating not only what is going on in Crimea today and attitudes, but the way it has changed over the last 7 years since the Russian annexation. So thank you to all of you. As I said at the beginning, this session is being recorded and will be available later on the Chatham House website. So thank you to you. Thank you to all our participants. We could have gone on for much longer. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of your questions. Goodbye for now.